Hello, ladies and gentlemen, my name's Stepsbasic and welcome back to my community show. I didn't sing it that time, did I? Anyway. Maybe I'll get back to singing it later. Anyway, today we're going to talk about one of my favorite genre to write. Yes, I know, I've been rambling on about horror and comedy and all that stuff, and I think I may even have covered sci-fi. No, I haven't covered sci-fi. But I've actually technically covered all genres in the one of my community shows. At one point I talked about the various different genres. But anyway, today we're going to talk about fantasy. Yes, fantasy. I love fantasy novels. They're my favorite. But also in video games too. I'm sure we're all aware of some of the greater names in the fantasy genre, i.e. Final Fantasy. That one's a pretty fantastical one. So technically, we all wonder, what really defines something as fantasy? Well, generally when it comes to fantasy, you can basically call anything so much fantasy as long as it takes place essentially in a fictional area. I mean, it's a fantastical world. A world that doesn't exist where we live, you know. You can actually write fantasy, though, using current world, you know, where we live at the moment. You could use Earth as a fantasy. You just have to include things like monsters and dragons and spells and whatnot. Things that are fantastic, you know, not of the norm, above and beyond that which we are used to and what we know. Which is why, more often than not, most fantasy worlds will be separate from our own. You won't see very many fantasy like Earth. So, like I was saying earlier, a good idea of what fantasy is Final Fantasy. However, lately, Final Fantasy has been more diverging into sci-fi. So you get the good crossover between sci-fi and fantasy, and that's actually one of my favorite types of things to watch. I mean, if you obvious choice, Star Wars, sci-fi fantasy, opera, beautiful, amazing, everybody loves it. So fantasy to me, shut up. Fantasy to me is a good escape from reality. This is the sort of thing I always write. But also, when I was a kid, I used to always just dream of being those knights in their armor and their big swords, and you can see it in my gameplay where I always charge face first into battle with honor and courage, and you cannot defeat me for I am superior with my sword, and then I get hit in the face with an icicle and I die. It's annoying. But there's not really a whole lot that defines fantasy above everything else, other than, of course, the fantastical nature of it, i.e. creatures and spells and often worlds that are completely separate from reality. And we love that sort of thing. That's why I think of fantasy as the best escape, because, well, there's no stress like in horror. Well, I say I love horror, but it carries with it a certain degree of stress. And in fantasy, there's none of that stress. You just sit back and you enjoy an epic tale, listening, reading, playing, whatever the medium you're using, through an adventure. And we can all see ourselves in the characters portrayed in fantasies. Like, if I were this person, I would be so heroic. I would be that man with the sword, when in all actuality, if we were actually there, we'd probably die in the first few minutes. Because, well, fantasy. That's how it works, you know. Can't really picture me going up against a dragon, because, well, I am stalwart and handsome and rugged and have an amazing beard. Can't really translate that well into slaying dragons. Yeah, that's the thing. But let's see, what some of my favorite fantasies. Obviously, I mentioned Final Fantasy, but obviously, but you can't forget the magnum opus that is the Elder Scrolls series. All the way from Arena and Daggerfall up till now with Skyrim and Elder Scrolls Online. They have had a serious world created. Tamriel and all that stuff. And so That game, that series in itself is, in my opinion, the best Western RPG out there. And yeah, I know there are more, there are bigger ones, maybe. I don't know if sure if there's actually any that are actually bigger in scope than Skyrim and well, the Elder Scrolls, I should just say, cover the entire world, as it were. I mean, the other Bethesda title obviously is the Fallout series, but that's more sci-fi fantasy. Again, nothing wrong with sci-fi fantasy, but you know, that's okay. And yes, I picked up a copy of Skyrim's new edition. I heard they're going to be putting in a survival mode. Dude, that sounds friggin' awesome. You'll be able to have to camp and everything. Although I did find out something kind of interesting about that. Namely, that there was a mod for it that was already out. But of course, being a PlayStation owner, I don't really have access to too many mods, as it were. But yeah, sorry, this video is not as in-depth as it could have been. I have adult responsibilities today. I have to go out and pay bills and all that jazz. But I just wanted to get in and talk about fantasy, because that's the style I write in. I mean, I do write a lot of horror and I do write some science fiction, but fantasy is like my number one go-to when it comes to writing. My biggest series to date, I guess technically counts as urban fantasy at the moment, but it really spans the history of humankind, and that's really cool. So, you know, they got natural the usual fantasy elements and all that stuff, and I'm like, yes. But yeah, that's it for today's episode. Thank you guys for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please go and poke the like button for me. If you'd like to, you can comment down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can, when I can, if I can, you know, all that jazz. And tune in next time when we will talk about something else. And until then, night.